friends, this is Rick, and this is your seat at the table. I want to talk about initiative, all right? The evolution specifically of initiative and its purpose. There's a lot of people who have different opinions on it, of course. A lot of people who believe it's not necessary anymore. I also want to apologize. I have a slight lisp now. Like I said, previous video, I've had some upper dental work, which is pretty extensive, and I have to wait for it to heal to get a new plate. A lifetime of drinking Pepsi has its price. That said, so initiative goes back to the earliest tabletop games, and most of those tabletop games were war games at the time. See, I've got a selection, and not just D&D, because I grabbed my old Star Wars West End version too, because it touches on the subject. But if we go back to specifically D&D material, I want to talk about Gary Gygax's Chainmail. This is one, obviously a PDF copy. It's not an original. Once upon a time, I had an option or an opportunity to buy one of them, and they were pretty cheap at the Irish Dungeon, but I just never did. So I took the liberty to acquire a PDF, print it out. This is also by Gary Gygax's third edition. I tried finding the first edition, but they're very rare. So when we look at the concept of initiative and its purpose, the initial idea or very initial role that Gary Gygax envisioned was that both opponents roll the dice or flip a coin, with the higher side going first. The higher dice score has the choice of electing to move first or last. This mindset has carried through to 5th edition, through all these generations of D&D and a slew of other role-playing game source or systems out there, because most systems that are built today or the last 20 years ride heavily on the experiences that were published and printed and developed by the older game systems. And so when we talk about D&D, even if you go back to the red and blue box sets, the very basic concept of the first edition, the white books, that the initiative system is quite simple, yet important in a number of ways. Now, because this is tabletop war games, Gary Gygax's love of tabletop war games evolved into what we know as D&D. And it's a transitional love. It's a development that he would have players that would go, well, instead of moving armies against each other, what if we just had 2 knights battling it out? How would we approach this? And from there, he develops a system. The system then starts incorporating things that involve more and more non-combat scenarios around individual small groups, a squad-based unit, which is what a traditional adventure party of today is, 3 to 5 people, right, and or individuals. So, and his object was he gave his players or his contemporaries of the day, because a lot of these rules he was making not just for his friends but for himself, to evolve from existing tabletop material and getting it in print so it was universal, so that it was fixed. We have a lot of license as GMs to create what we call homebrew, right? What's homebrew today used to be house rules, and still is. And there's always people get touchy or sore when that happens, and we conflict things with the latest lexicon and latest verbiage with stuff from the, anyway. So he came up with the counter move system. Both opponents, both sides roll to see who goes first. And the person who rolls the highest is allowed the choice to act or to react. And the second option was considered a simultaneous move system. This is a much more complicated and somewhat convoluted system, and yet it can still be simple. In this case, what he's doing is you take a note and you write down what you're going to do, what your units are going to do, and then both sides sit down and then begin moving their units according to their written orders until their written orders come into conflict with actions of the other side. So that was the initial concept of initiative from way back in the day. And this evolved into our game systems and carried over. Since this is the closest thing I have to the original first edition, this is not the actual first edition print. It is several prints later, but because you can tell by the difference in the artwork, it's still first edition AD&D. And I played it quite a lot in my lifetime. And in here, we have pretty much a straightforward. The initiative factor affects who can do what and when during the course of an encounter of any sort. Surprise already covered. Here the two obliviates the need for initiation checks, as the surprise party has complete freedom of action for a time. However, surprise eventually wins, and then, just as in other circumstances, the relative weight of action must be determined. Initiative allows one group, the party, or the monsters to begin some course of action prior to the other group. Actions affected by initiative are many, include slamming a door, fleeing, moving, grappling, etc., etc. The initiative check is typically made with two six-sided dice, 1d6 for the party and another of different size or color for the creatures encountered. This check is made each round of play where the first action is a factor. Because a round is a full minute long, dexterity is seldom a factor, or hastened, or one of the other members of the group. If you have spells that allow you one or more of the group to move at a quicker pace, then they get a modifier, or they would be preempted by being allowed to go first. So we're looking at the very base initial concept of initiative from first edition, and pretty much from the earlier editions of just plain D&D. And if you believe otherwise, by all means, make your commentary and give me the reasons. So then we moved to second edition, which was through the mid 80s to early 90s that we utilized. And then we talk about initiative. This role determines who acts first. Basically the same thing that comes over. There's not a lot of change between the first edition and the second edition, although it includes the caveat that there are also two optional methods that each can be determined initiative. Each of these operational methods breaks the group action down into more individual initiatives. However, the general method of determining initiative remains the same in all cases. The standard initiative procedure, based off of first edition and prior versions, is to determine who goes first. And then we have a list of modifiers that can affect initiative. So we have difference. And then we see the beginning of alternative. Otherwise, what can be considered house rules or homebrew. But I'll make the argument that they're not either, because they are established in the core book as options. That means they are existing rule sets that we can choose to use and didn't have to come up with our own. I mean, if we modify them and change them, then it becomes our own. We got the individual initiative and the group initiative. The idea behind it, and you're all pretty familiar with this, is speed and expediency. Back in the day, we used to just roll initiative one time. This was to set the pace, set the line of progression, if you will. So either the group went first or the monsters went first. Straightforward. And it carried through the entire encounter. Nothing changes, period. Individual initiative allows for a lot more flexibility and realism. Combat is fluid. Actions and interactions in a matter of seconds relatively change. One of the things I do in my games is to let you know how many seconds have passed. So when we're doing combat, and combat on the table could take a couple hours, I've seen it go that long. And I've seen it go in 15 minutes. I mean, it's just a matter of how quick, how fast, and how capable, and how, what the balance is between the sides. So having the ability to tweak this, change it, make it more fluid, more challenging, is appealing to a lot of people, myself included. This is one of the reasons why we start to see variance on the house, the core rule, and core rule variance. One of those variants, of course, is having each individual roll initiative separately at the beginning of each combat round. So we last 5 rounds of combat, which could take 45 minutes at the table or half an hour. In reality, only 35 minutes, or 30 minutes, or 50 minutes, or 50 seconds, excuse me, almost a minute based on the old system of a round being 10 seconds long. It's a later change to 6 seconds, so you have 10 rounds in a minute as opposed to 6 rounds in a minute. And so, in theory, things are happening pretty quick. And I like to remind the players that when I do my encounters. I will go combat round 1, 6 seconds. Combat round 2, 12 seconds, etc. 12 seconds has passed. And by having each individual, or in some cases when you're talking a larger party and larger groups of bad guys, going by a squad base. So the players can play, if there's 5 players and I got 15 bad guys they're facing up against, I will ask them all to roll individual initiative at the beginning of each round. And yes, it's clunky. Yes, it's asking for extra dice rolls. But I like the flexibility it presents in each combat round. Things change up. And some players agree with it and enjoy it, and some players have problems with it, take umbrage with it because they feel it cheats them somehow, no matter how much I argue the other way. In the case of the larger group of bad guys, I will break them down into groups of 5 and do 3 initiatives for groups. So that way they're not all acting at one time, and I'm not bogged down with 15 rolls. And so, as the game progresses, foes are eliminated, players are neutralized potentially. This shrinks down the pool of numbers that we need to roll. So at some point where my bad guys are cut in half, at this point I'll either start rolling in sets of 2 or 3 or individually for them. And I write it down. I write it down in a line of progression each round. Yes, it seems like it's a little extra paperwork, but as the GM, that's on me. I mean, that's my paperwork to deal with and not the players. As long as it doesn't take me an arm and a leg and half an hour to do, we're all good. But what it does, in my opinion, is allow for players to act and interact with their foes and have things occur that change things. So I can have a player who puts it down that this is what he's going to do. He runs out and targets a specific foe. Unfortunately, when the initiative is set, the foe acts first, and perhaps the foe is cut down by somebody else, or the foe disengages and runs away. In either case, the player comes out with a specific target in mind to discover the target's no longer there. At that point, we either make these, and that happens in a fluid environment. You plan something and what you plan to do doesn't happen, and you move on. Or you get into a give or take negotiation about whether, should the player be optioned to find another target. And I usually agree with that if there's a target readily available. If they have to make extra movements or actions, then their turn is done for that combat round, and not to take it personal. And yet there are players who will do this. There's always upsides and downsides to using variance and an opinion, right? Usually we try to establish all this stuff in session 0, but the sheer volume of things that we may want to achieve over time in a game session or in a campaign may not be feasible to cover every potential contingency within the first day's session. Try, but it doesn't always work. So you're talking about initiative and variance on the initiative system as it's evolved and grown into a bit more control-based or rule-heavy style of system, which brings us to the biggest rule-heavy system, 3.5 or 3rd edition, however you want to look at it. And this involves things that also apply into like attacks of opportunity, which I said before, my belief in the 5th edition version, which the book's out in the living room right now, and I'm not going to go after it, has quantified and simplified a lot of the rules from earlier editions to make them less dice heavy. And we can role play a lot of this stuff in story without necessarily tossing dice. And I'm with that. As long as I have an idea, and I'm pretty anal when it comes to that initiative roll. I want to know your line of progression. I want to know where your actions are going to take place within the story on a timeline. And we can be fluid about a lot of things, but how often you get to act and when should not be one of those things, in my opinion, right? Just in my opinion. So in here, initiative, better part of a half a page, almost 3/4 of a page. We got initiative checks, following the usual style, initiative checks for your monsters. Then they add things like being flat-footed at the start of battle before you've had a chance to act, specifically for your regular turn. This basically puts in with surprise. If you were caught off guard, you were caught by surprise, you're flat-footed and you do not have the luxury to act first. That's a variant. It's not, and according to this, that is the rule for 3.5. It's not a variation. But we also have something we talk about, which is added from the that's added to the new system and the evolution, is something called inaction. Even if you can't take actions, for instance, you become paralyzed or unconscious, you retain your initiative score for the duration of the encounter. For example, when paralyzed by a ghoul, you may miss out one or more actions, but once the cleric casts remove paralysis, you then may act again on your next turn. So if you're based off of an initial one initiative roll, then everybody maintains that. So if for some reason your player becomes or your character becomes incapacitated, he or she has not lost her position in the line of progression. If you're doing a fluid initiative every combat round, like I prefer, which is a variant based in a 2nd edition, that you can then do still would roll, even if your character is unconscious, because there's a possibility perhaps you make a fortitude save, or one of your companions get over to you and initiate some kind of healing spell or ability, or some other thing comes into effect. It allows you to regain the action. And even if you're in that unconscious state, and this got me into a big debate with some players not recently between the differences between 3.5 and 5th edition. And why I don't bring up 4th edition is because I don't own it. And I played it and I ran it for a couple of years. A friend of mine went out and purchased about $200 worth of this stuff. He bought about 10 of the core books when they first came out. And so it's okay. It's not my cup of tea. It really is more of a new generation version of the original D&D, in my opinion. It took out a lot of things that you'd have to fall back on other books to find useful, or that they added later as people requested them. So in 5th edition, if your character points hit 0, you're done. If the monster hits 0, you're done. They allow for things like fortitude saves. If you can stabilize yourself, if you're successful, it simplifies things. I still believe in the 3.5 version, and where it allows you to have down to -10. And what this is this slow bleed out period, or this slow die period, where you have an opportunity. Because remember, 10 hit points is roughly 10 rounds if you're losing it slowly. And in that case, that's almost quite a considerable amount of time to lapse. So by the time you potentially lose all 10 of your points, assuming you didn't start in a huge negative to begin with. I mean, if you hit -20 right off the gate, you're gone. But anyway, there's an opportunity to potentially revive fellow players, revive bad guys for other reasons. Perhaps you want to question them. Perhaps you need information. Perhaps you're not a mob of bloodthirsty whatever, and you figure, just save this person and give them, whatever. So the options. And there are people who are diehards. 5th edition is 5th edition, and we should never go back on any of the old stuff. And that's good and fine, acceptable, if you agree to that. I always argue, though, and this often cheeses people in my games, and I can only apologize for being me, but I believe that all these other books exist for a reason, and just because you choose to not have anything other than 5th edition doesn't mean I have to. And if I'm running the show, then we're back to that argument of home rules or house rules or home brew, if you will. Anyway, the initiative concept was that we added from the 2nd edition was a little bit more flexibility. By 3.5, we have included a caveat for inaction, and we go into a little bit more better information on surprise and determining awareness and how often. It says the surprise round. If some but not all the combatants are aware of their opponents, the surprise round happens before the regular round begins. Any combat, so that person ideally is some people can be aware of a situation and didn't bother to tell the rest of their party about it. They would not be caught by surprise. The others would be. That is in the rules for 3.5, and you can consider the variant in other games if you wish, but it's the concept and it's still there. And just, we're rocking it. So we get into more higher level options when it comes to initiatives. 5th edition still has initiative, and it gives you the option of one initiative roll for the entire game session or for the entire encounter, or a flowing one each round. And generally, it's most people prefer, by the time they get to people who are learning 5th edition and have not access to other game systems, older systems, they prefer that one shot. We only have to worry about it once. And if you're good with it, you're comfortable with it, that's fine. I just find that as more experienced players are involved, as a more experienced GM, having that flow of changing flow and combat adds to the flavor, in my opinion. And so when we look at initiative, it's the reason I got my Star Wars book out. And ID, this is the old Western games. I have this one. I also have the 2nd edition version of this, by the way, and because I'm going to do a little review on it here shortly. Also, I used to have access to the D20 version of Star Wars, and that one I really liked. I wish I had a hard copy of that myself. One of these days, when I get an opportunity and some extra money, I think we'll hunt one down and purchase it. The book belonged to a friend of mine, and he decided he didn't want to run the game, and he loaned it to me, and we played D&D, or we played Star Wars D20 for 3 years, 4 years, and we were probably playing. We alternated between D&D and Star Wars on a monthly basis, so we played a lot of it. And then when we parted ways, obviously I gave this book back to him, and so on and so forth. And so when we look at, my reasoning is to show that it's not just in D&D that initiative is evolved. So when we look at initiative here, normally it doesn't matter when during an action segment a particular character gets to act. Everyone just moves, shoots, or uses some other skill. The only time it matters is if someone uses a skill that will affect another character's skill use. Example, Rourke fires at Jana and vice versa. If Rourke gets his shot off before Jana does and wounds her, Jana never gets off the shot. She gets to shoot back. So they still have their initiative, and it's quite similar to the D&Ds, because D&D, and like I said, if you go back to Gary Gygax's earliest stuff, we set the bar here and start moving forward, and we find it in a lot of game systems, or some variant thereof of initiative. Some system to allow fair decision, an impartial way of determining who gets to act first, so we can establish a line of progression. So what I liked about this little point is this kind of nails down what the whole point of initiative is, and it helps reinforce what I like, the fluidity of the initiative system that I choose. Is the fact is, somebody takes an action, whether it's a player or a bad guy, and that bad guy's action results in another bad guy or player's inability to act or changes their action. It happens first, then this happens. So the same goes back to my little argument I had with a player in my D&D Beyond campaign, where he was terribly upset that he came out, he established from this is what I'm going to do. He came out and the target he wanted had left, and there was no target to shoot at. And he could have, well, I shift my aim and shoot at somebody else. And the problem was that from where he was standing, there was nobody else to shoot except one of us, except bodies and his own companions. And hello, right? That he felt he should have had the opportunity to get a free action and pursue, or that his action was invalidated by the bad guy escaping, and so he should have been able to adjust his action. And I gave him the opportunity to roll to see if he had to succeed in a reaction, which means I would give him that mulligan. And he got, this is where the debate took off, and everybody got a little soured on it. And in part, that's my fault, because I love a good debate, even when I'm wrong. And I don't think I was. So I'm going to take a look at my notes, and we're going to talk about, just a few things more, and then we'll end this video. And if it's useful, if it's helpful, I hope it is. I feel the need to do these things occasionally. So from first edition, the initiative initially appears, according to my research, in 1977, first edition AD&D. A Dungeon Master's instruction to roll initiative has become the iconic signal that a combat encounter has begun, and that still holds true today. Some spells can be used to modify initiative. For example, Bless, in the form of guidance, can be used to modify initiative if you read the strict ruling and the strict example or wording of how the spell works. Initiative is also not a skill, so it cannot be improved like a skill. There are some people that believe that we should be able to put points or whatever into making ourselves faster or more likely to react. And the argument is that initiative is not speed, it is not movement, it is not dexterity. That is something you do inside of a round. The initiative just tells us when you get to do that thing. And if argument is that if you then decide that you are quicker or faster, then perhaps within it you can do a preemptive move. But generally speaking, that's not how initiative is viewed from anything I've read. Before first edition, before first AD&D, there were vague rules that were often referred to, it's in here, to the Gygax chainmail tabletop system, which we've already covered a little bit. And chainmail, yeah, already talked. The amount of time in combat rounds also evolved. Originally, it was a minute, so you would have 1 minute per combat round, which it felt was quite excessive. That you really have way too much things you can do in a minute. So it became 10 seconds. And then it became 6 seconds, which is where we consider our combat rounds now at 6 seconds apiece. And Gygax tried to account for every possibility when he created things. This is one of the reasons it originally took a minute. Things like weighted weapons, length, spellcasting time, surprise rolls, etc. His belief was certain weapon systems should move first in combat, i.e. the ranged weapons always shoot first because they're the furthest away. Long pole arm, people with a long arm weapon got the option to go before people with swords because they had a longer reach, right? So we have different rules in there based on reach and range and things like that affect combat, but generally it's been evolved out of that the initial idea on initiative itself. Gygax agreed that the 1 minute combat round accounted for feints, parries, maneuvering, as well as the attack, and it turned out to be a mess by a lot of us at the earliest stages of trying to understand and grapple with, just because we were doing so much stuff. We were actually, if you went down around it, we were doing multiple actions within a single combat round, and it was kind of, I don't know, overkill. Then from his Blackmore supply or supplement, Gygax quoted, "All of it is, of course, optional. For the premise of the whole game is flexibility and personalization within the broad framework of the rule. A&D is crunchy, often confusing, jumble rules and ideas train players to ignore any text that missed the mark. It probably added to later designs to smooth the process." See, that was my opinion on that, and I believe that, and I still believe that there's a healthy value for having the older, crunchier rule sets because they give us a basis from which simplicity and ease of play can be conducted because we have already been there and established as many possible contingents as necessary, and then we now reduce them to quantify them. But even in 5th edition, and I could not seem to reason, or when I tried to explain it, it didn't, I guess I just didn't able to explain it to my player at the last week very well. But the point in 5th edition is that even though rules, so if we look at perception, for example, within perception we have things like spot and listen and search. And the reasons they're still there is because sometimes as the GM we want to have a little bit more narrowing of the field. So general perception checks let you aware, in my opinion, that something's in the room. But if you actively want to find that thing out, we should use, you can still use the perception because that's your base, but if you call it spot or search or listen, it's not the wrong thing to say because it falls under that role. We're still rolling that perception roll, but we're just being focused. We're specifying in game, in character, that I'm searching the corner. I'm narrowing my field. Anyway, so that brings us my question. Can you play any role-playing game without initiative? Have I? I have not ever played a game that doesn't have some form of initiative. Even if it's something as simple as flipping a coin or rock, paper, scissors, or the gentleman or gentlewoman's agreement where we say, you know, I'll let you go first. It's still established who begins a line of progression for an encounter. So, till next time, this is Rick, and this is your seat at the table. And hope you have a good weekend. It is deucedly cold here in Iowa.